So, a couple of weeks ago, someone came to the door of the church and they wanted to speak to the pastor. It was urgent. So, Aaron came and he let me know. Usually, when this happens, somebody's going through a crisis of some kind. And I stopped what I was doing and I came over to the door, and the person said, "You're the pastor?" And I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "I want to talk to you about that sign." I'm like, okay, all right. She said, "That sign is not correct. Jesus never said what's on your sign." And for those of you who may not have seen the sign, who might be online, the sign says, "Jesus condemns ICE. Stop justifying evil, murdering, kidnapping, and harm of children." Matthew 25. And to be fair, 2,000 years ago, Jesus certainly didn't say, "I condemn ICE in the year 2026 in this place that's going to be called the United States." Just like Jesus never says 2,000 years ago, "I see that there's going to be this terrible administration rising in Europe called the Nazis, and I got to condemn them right now too, or it's not legit." If I don't say it 2,000 years ago and name the specific group of people, then I'm fine with them. That doesn't happen. But I reference Matthew 25, and I think, well, maybe they're just not familiar with this passage. And I ask, can I read this? And they say, sure. Because I think they want to talk about this side. It sounded to me like they wanted to have a conversation about this. And so I read this passage from Matthew 25, commonly referred to as the separation of the sheep and the goats. I have preached about it before, but I just kind of want to get to the nuts and bolts of it right now. Jesus calls together all the peoples of the earth. They're from all the different ethnos, all the different nations, different people groups of the world. And this is like the end times / beginning of new times. God is intervening at the culmination of all things to begin a world made right. The Olam Haba. And to start that off, first they got to judge. They've got to separate the folks who have already been here. And so some folks go to the right and some go to the left, and to those on the right, Jesus, the Son of Man in this passage, says, "You get to join me and God in this world made right, in this beloved community, in this kingdom of God. Because I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was sick and you took care of me. I was a prisoner and you visited me. I was a stranger in the land and you welcomed me." And the folks who are on the right are like, "What are you talking about? I've never seen you before in my life. When did I ever do any of those things?" Jesus says, "Whenever you did it for the least of these, the most marginalized, you did it for me." And then Jesus turns to those on the left and says, "You don't get to be a part of this. You don't get to be a part of this because I was hungry and you didn't give me something to eat. And I was thirsty and you didn't give me anything to drink. And I was sick and you did not take care of me. I was in prison and you didn't visit me. And I was a stranger in your land and you did not welcome me." So you don't get to be a part of this. You got to go over there. And the woman responds to me, I do all of those things. And I say, great. Then this passage isn't about you. My sign's not about you then. But you're condemning ICE, and I support ICE. Well, ICE is who's the signs for, and people who are supporting them, because we ought to care about how our actions affect other people, how we're treating the stranger in our land, right? And if we're supporting folks who are kidnapping and murdering and stockpiling people in concentration camps, I mean, to me, that sounds worse than just ignoring the need of the stranger in our land, right? That is actively working against our immigrant neighbors and their children. The very definition of little ones, right? The most marginalized of the marginalized. And she says, yes, well, Jesus also says, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And I realized I got to preach on this passage. I wasn't going to preach on this passage because there's a lot to cover in the book of John. And I was like, for reasons I'm going to get into in a little bit, this one was on the chopping block. Then I realized, we actually do need to talk about this. We need to talk about this, and the more I reflected on it, the more I was coming to own, for most of us, this may be the only passage we know or have heard from the book of John. So that makes it even more important that we talk about it, right? So in our story, Jesus is teaching up on the Mount of Olives. And the religious leaders, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they collude together in the book of John. Now, they have a trepidatious relationship with one another historically. They're two different kind of religious and social leadership factions. But in our story, they're working with one another because they both want to discredit Jesus. They're upset with him. They want to find some reason to shut him up. So they find this woman caught in the act of adultery, which, if I'm going to be honest, if I could name, like, the most embarrassing act to be caught in the middle of for others to, like, drag me out, and condemn me for, like, that's got to be top 5, right? They find this woman who is having sex with someone who is not her husband. And they drag her out in front of this crowd that Jesus is teaching on the Mount of Olives. So who knows how long this kidnapping walk was. I can't imagine they're carrying her, right? This has got to be akin to, like, not a walk of shame, but like a march of shame. And they say, hey, Jesus, we caught this woman in the middle of adultery. The law says we gotta stone her to death. It's what the law says. And our narrator tells us this is to try to trap him, to try to discredit him, right? Because this is like a no-win situation for Jesus. If Jesus is like, oh man, we got to do what the law says capital punishment, then she's murdered in front of everybody. And that's not the kind of thing that Jesus tends to be about in this book or the Gospels. But if Jesus lets this woman off the hook, then he is a lawbreaker. He is saying, hey, don't follow the law. The law says capital punishment. I want to point out, these leaders are not concerned about justice. If they were concerned, really, about justice, surely they would have the man committing adultery with her also brought forward. But that guy is nowhere to be seen in this story. Yeah, or he's like, whoo, hey, good luck. But also, there's not any real concern for fairness here either. Like, you could say, well, this is out of a sense of indignity for this woman's husband, but he's also not in this story. He's nowhere to be found. They don't go over to him, the person in the ancient world who has, we'll just say authority over her. They take her straight over to this crowd where Jesus is. They are using her as a pawn in a game of discreditation. They want to make Jesus look bad. They are kidnapping and threatening with murder a woman to make their ideology look better and his ideology look worse. Does that sound familiar? So Jesus bends down to the ground and he starts doodling in the sand. We never know what he's doodling. You know, it might be like cartoon animals, might be writing some words. We just don't know. And Jesus says, while he's doodling, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And these leaders are so convicted from this statement, from this invitation at self-reflection, that they drop their instruments of murder to the ground and they walk away. The implication being, for us, we've all made bad choices. We've broken the law, whether it be the Torah or just minor aspects of the rules our society's run by. So we shouldn't be so quick to rush to judgment, right? It's part of why this passage is so powerful is because it's just so beautiful and obvious, right? Jesus turns to the woman and he says, well, hey, where are all the folks who are going to kill you? Oh, they're not here? If they don't condemn you, I don't condemn you either. Go and sin no more. This is a story that has such great resonance. It ends up being told in like our literature in different versions again and again and again. One of the first American stories is the Scarlet Letter, right? It's just kind of like a long-form adaptation of this, in a sense. But I do want to point out that this is not a story about avoiding the confrontation of evil and avoiding the confrontation of wrongdoing. Because what is Jesus doing in this story? He's directly calling it out. He's directly pointing out the hypocrisy of what these leaders are doing. And Jesus does pick sides. This is one of my greatest frustrations when we pull from passages like this to be like, well, Jesus doesn't ever pick a side on anything. Therefore, Jesus must silently just promote my side. Therefore, Jesus is pro-Christian supremacy. Where are you getting that from? There are texts you can maybe like squinch and get that from, but it's not this one. It's not this text. This text, Jesus is confronting hypocrisy and wrongdoing of those thought leaders, any of us who may be tempted to not just think we're better than the most marginalized amongst us, but who utilize the marginalized for our own ends. Now, I want to get to the reason I almost skipped this passage. It's a forgery. One of my favorite passages in the book of John is a forgery. One of our favorite passages in the New Testament is not original to the book of John. It's a much later add-on. Our earliest copies that contain this story are from 200 to 300 years after the book of after our earliest copies of the book of John. It is a wow. That's a wow, right? And yet it is a very important story to so many of us. If we were to turn to the book of John in our Bibles or on our apps, and it wasn't there, we'd be like, what happened? You gotta have this. The way it made it into the text, it was probably a marginal, like a note in the margins at some point, because transcribers tended to do that. They would have various notes in the margins. And at some point, it got incorporated into the text during the transcribing process. So you gotta make copies of copies of copies, because the original stuff just falls apart. You gotta make the backup for it to continue on. And we have some copies of Luke that are also much later than our earliest copies of Luke that have this text in it. And we have some copies of John that have it at various places in the book of John, but eventually it ends up at its location, where it is now, and it just lives there. Maybe it was a story that was original to the teachings of Jesus, and it was kept alive in the oral tradition. Or maybe it was an an invention. That's what the word is. I'm adding too many sounds to invention. Maybe it was an invention that just sought to boil down the essence of Jesus's teachings on judgments down to a easily remembered story. Whatever the case, we have this profound nugget of a story that does sound very much like how Jesus is presented in Matthew and Mark and Luke. And I'm happy it's there. Forgery or not, it captures that essence of character, of what we expect from Jesus. And I think the Gospel of John would be much the poorer without it. Now, that's all interesting. But I want to share what my hope is, what we do with this passage. My hope is that when we consider this passage, we do indeed consider who we are tempted to cast our stones at. Are we piling up upon those who are already being crushed in our society? I see this happen all the time with our neighbors who live outside. It's just so easy for those of us who have housing stability to be like, well, look at them. They've done stuff wrong. Therefore, they must deserve to sleep and die outside. Are we piling up on those who are struggling to eat? Are we piling up on those who are just trying to make ends meet? feed their own kids? Who are we piling up on? Are we piling up on those who have committed the misdemeanor offense of overstaying their visa? Therefore, they deserve to be kidnapped, murdered, stockpiled in concentration camps? Who are we casting stones at? Are we able to look at ourselves and think, well, I have stuff I need to work on that I certainly wouldn't want others to abuse me for? I jaywalked the other day. Maybe I shouldn't do that. There is this one time I stole candy out of a candy bowl, and that is stealing. I'm really grateful that I didn't get arrested for shoplifting. We've made mistakes. We've done things wrong. I'm not even saying that those who have come to this country out of a sense of desperation and trying to find a new life for them and their kids have done something wrong, but this is what I'm hearing all the time from folks that I love who taught me about mercy and kindness when I was in their church, right? We got to be merciful and kind to one another. But somehow, we look at folks who are in worse positions than we are, who are in some level of vulnerability, and justify that it must be self-inflicted, it must be deserved. Well, think about this passage. I think Jesus would have a bone to pick with you from this passage. Not just Matthew 25, but this casting stones passage that was cited at me. And I hope we consider the paramount need for us to stand up for and with the oppressed and marginalized in our society, including women who are still actively dehumanized. I mean, there's a reason this story has resonated throughout the ages, because I think so many of us have known women who have been used as pawns to justify the power games of other men. Men who say they care about justice and fairness, but don't. Including the stranger in our lands, who are actively and intentionally abused to suit the whims of powerful people who use them as pawns in their games. This is ultimately the takeaway that I carry with me from this passage. When I think about this passage, what I think of is a call to keep showing up in love for one another, for and with our neighbors. And I think of the invitation to not rush to condemnation, but to live into mercy. And to stand up to those that threaten to obliterate our neighbors. That's the work of Jesus. That's our work. I invite you to consider all of this next time you think about this passage. Next time you see our neighbors actively being villainized by those who do not give a damn about villainy. Now, with all of that said, my friends, I don't want to share. I don't want to share too much. Maybe we'll see her again, maybe we won't. I hope I got to plant a seed. I hope that she's doing some reflection and introspection. I want to point out I've needed people to call me in too, to plant a seed in me, to invite me to do some introspection and reflection as well. Some of you have mentioned that this marquee has been useful and helpful for you. And I'm glad for that. Somebody mentions they heard honking as they were walking in through the door because of this sign. Part of the reason I'm leaving it up. Yeah. But my hope with that sign is that we are planting seeds, you know? I don't know what fruit will be born out from it, and I have to let that go. I have to let go of the need to cultivate fruits that is being potentially harvested in somebody else's life. But I think that's part of why we need to be able to call out evil when we see it happening. Some folks will nurture that fruit. I have. Some of you have, right? And others will be really upset. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's okay. All right. I don't normally take questions and comments. Yes, Jan. I love that. Reach out to Jessica with Restorative Justice. We have kind of a beginning relationship with Russell Helpers. And also, I would love to have coffee sometime. All right, my friends. Don't continue agging me on. We'll never get to coffee and cookies.